Welcome back to the Transplaning Podcast for part 2 with Dr. Kristine Coons.
Welcome
Yay!
back. Welcome back.
So glad to be back. This is so exciting. And, we kind of started out with a little bit of my history, and I was super excited to start into this whole entire nosedive into science and medicine and all that stuff of the things I've done. And I'm excited about this.
I've been excited. Honestly, I've been excited. I've been talking you up for a while. I've been really excited for this episode. So there's no pressure. But
No,
what?
there's a lot of pressure.
I feel like there's more pressure on me here because we are in a field that I know nothing about, and so I've been so worried I'm going to be just this big numpty here on the show that doesn't know
Oh,
what's happening.
I worry about that too. I'm very limited in my knowledge as well. My education
I
is so old.
I hope to make this accessible. So I did a presentation this last week to a group of physicians in California. There was about 50, 60 of them, and it was just one of those where I was so grateful to be part of a tool to improve the care of individuals. They provide gender affirming care and intersex care and stuff like that, and it was just really neat to have that feedback from them, like, oh, I get it, I see what you were talking about, and it was just really empowering.
Yeah.
So being able to carry this message through to a lot of people and like sift through these weeds of all these different narratives and the rhetoric that comes from different people and go, oh, that makes sense. This is why it is the way it is.
Right, right. Well, with that being said, I think it's fair to just start off with there's only two genders, right? Male and female.
It's the answer to that is it's more complicated than that. And when I started with this presentation, I started with just a etymology of just the words male and female and
That's
talking about
fascinating.
sex. And when I started looking into this, or started this whole entire process, when I was talking about going through all these weeds and things like that, I had to actually get to the very brass tacks of what actually male, female, man, and woman is or is not, because we see that, what's the show? What is a woman? I watched that documentary. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. This is not helpful, and this is actually causing more harm. And you see that in Charlie Kirk's debates or Matt Walsh's debates of what is a woman, and then they go off into their spiels against transgender individuals, and that doesn't explain anything. It doesn't include intersex individuals. It doesn't include gender diverse individuals. It doesn't explain why gender diversity exists. So I needed to get a better answer about that. And so I started with just looking up a whole bunch of dictionaries. And the first one I wanted to look up is just the oldest English dictionary I could find is the table alphabetical containing the hard and unusual words of the English language, I think is what the title of it is.
Well, if that's all.
This is a weird title, but it was first published in 1607. And keep in mind the King James Version of the Bible was published in 1611. So that gives a reference point of where this comes from. Now, this dictionary only has 2,000 words.
If that's all.
That's all it has. That's all it has. And so I went through and I'm like, okay, help me with these words. Now, the word male is not found in this dictionary. The word female is.
Okay.
Because apparently female is a hard, unusual word in the English language.
I mean, I got so many thoughts in my head right now.
But the definition they used was the she in mankind. You could actually look up this dictionary online, table alphabetical of the English language, blah, 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 hard, unusual words. We actually publish these dictionaries online to help us understand old texts.
Okay.
So I show a picture of the definition, and it's literally the she in mankind, which is not a helpful definition. Actually, when you look at that text and say, what does that imply? It's a social construct. There is no anatomy. There is no physiology that's being performed. This is actually in an era that is very basic or rudimentary to begin with. The definition of male and female did not start as a scientific term.
Interesting.
As we progressed through the dictionaries, Webster's, I got to pull up the phrase I use with this one. Webster's dictionary comes along in 1828, and it says, now you can actually start seeing some of the stuff that we use in modern times pertaining to the sex that procreates young and applied to animals of all kinds, as a male child, a male beast, fish, or fowl. And then in the 1913 one, it says, an animal of the male sex, of or pertaining to the sex that begets or procreates young, to the sex that produces spermatozoa by which the ova are fertilized, not female. So that's part of the definition is male is not female. So now we're starting to create this contrast. This is 1913. We're trying to separate the sexes. Well, why are we doing this in the first place? Because of structure, because of social hierarchy that occurred during this time.
What did they call people before 1913?
Well, they said male or female, but think about it this way. If you had to work with inheritance patterns or land rights, family structure, marriages, and things like that,
right,
in this era, this was an important thing to understand. And so as we discovered more and more, for example, the chromosomes themselves were discovered in 1877. The sex chromosomes were not discovered until 1906. So we're taking this definition from 1607, hundreds of years ago, and as we move forward through time, we're applying scientific applications to it. We're saying a female is XX chromosomes based off of our information from 1906.
Right.
With that discovery of the sex chromosomes by Nettie Stevens. There was actually other people that discovered it, but Nettie Stevens, go girl. She was actually studying, I think it was fruit flies, and just noticed that one of the chromosomes looked different between the males and the females, and that's how it was discovered. But that was 1906. That's not that long ago. We're talking a little over 100 years.
Wow.
So these definitions evolved over time as we made these scientific discoveries, and there's actually some other really cool discoveries that I like to point out. So Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, he passed away in 1884.
Okay.
So his work actually, because he was a monk in a monastery, his work was not rediscovered until a couple decades later. And Reginald Punnett, that horrible Punnett square that we learned in biology.
Right.
1906. This book, Mendeliism, is the first biology book. It was published in 1911.
Wow.
I actually read it from front to cover, and it brings up the Punnett squares. It talks a lot about chickens.
Okay. There's a lot of different characteristics between different types of chickens. So in some ways, I guess that would make sense.
That's what they're using. So Reginald Punnett was, taking the peas that Mendel used, and he was adding in some other perspectives from different animal species and things like that. So Punnett squares are over 100 years old. Wow. Now, did we stop learning at 1911 and said, enough is enough, we don't need to learn anymore? Well, of course not, because other advances came into being. Klinefelters, where we talk about intersex individuals, that was first described in 1942, and the XXY was not identified until 1956. 75 years ago.
That's interesting because this brings us into a different topic, right? Because you'll hear a lot of people in the anti-trans argument say that you either have XX or XY, so how do you get extra letters?
Oh, I love talking about this subject because it's just part of our inherent DNA genetic process. This is really cool. Now, I'm not going to go into that just yet because I have to lay this foundation first.
Okay.
So in terms of the language that we use, male, female, as a binary term are incomplete as a metric that we can use to describe fully another human being. And there's reasons for that. For example, if we apply the current definition and say that it's based off of sperm production, well, what about those who don't produce sperm? Well, they say, well, it's organized around the fact that you could produce sperm.
Right.
Well, that's not a binary. You're introducing possibilities of exceptions. Well, then they say, well, fine, then it will include intersex people in the midst of all this. Well, again, that's not a binary.
It's a
So
trinary.
it's even more than that. It's even more than that. And so when people come along and say it's going to be one or the other, and even intersex people are going to fit into one or the other. Well, in the world that I work in, what about those individuals that have 3 gonads or 4 gonads? Where
That's
2
a
of them are
thing?
yes, it is a polygonadism. 2 gonads, 2 ovaries, or ovotestes. What if you don't have either of them? What if you were born without a penis or a vagina? That is also a thing.
I don't know what to say. That's a lot.
It's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to actually incorporate these ideas into how we develop, we have to go a step further. We can't just stop and say, oh, it's based off of sex chromosomes, because that does not give us a complete picture. We need to expound on this subject way beyond what we know right now.
It makes a lot of sense to me. So with that kind of basis in mind, can you just give us a real brief definition? You got all the dictionaries there. But between, sex versus identity versus gender.
So when I approach these definitions, I have to pull from the science and the data that says, okay, I have to work with this one way. But at the same time, I actually have to also work from society's perspective, where society is at, and be able to talk past each other. We have to be on the same terms that we're talking about.
Okay.
So when we talk about male and female, can I describe that as you produce sperm? Sure. Can I just describe female as somebody who produces eggs? Sure. But we have to break down the barriers. We have to break down the edges, because intersex people are part of this whole entire equation. And as an extension of that, so are gender diverse individuals.
Okay.
So we have to be able to actually say, how do we get to that point? How do we get from point A, conception, to point B, human being, who has a presentation that may or may not fit a phenotypic profile of male and female? How you appear at the back end.
Okay.
This is where it gets fun.
It sounds like it, because originally you're talking that male and female were social constructs, originally back in 1611.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if it came in as social constructs and then we just have updated it, then aren't sex and gender just the same thing then?
Terminologies change over time. There was a time where they were synonymous.
Okay.
I believe you can actually look into the 1830s dictionary about gender, where you can talk about an engendered flock, engendered birds, like assigning or looking at them and saying there is a sex assigned to this group of individuals.
Okay.
Now, what happened over time is that we in the scientific field realized that we are missing terminology. We're missing ways to describe certain aspects of the existence of human beings, where we had to look at the physical aspect of humans and look at the mental aspect of humans, the brain.
Okay.
And so we needed a term to be able to actually incorporate with that. And that's actually how gender identity evolved into being what it is this innate sense of self, is because we needed a term to be able to describe this notion that exists.
Fascinating. That fascinates me. Are you wanting to get into the portion about XX and Y
Oh
and
yeah,
all of that? Z?
yeah. So in terms of where we're at with this right now, in terms of where society is, there's a ton of narratives that exist right now. There's the right wing narrative, there's the left wing narrative, there's actually a whole bunch of narratives inside of the gender diverse population. Even the intersex community has a whole bunch of narratives that they're using to say, I exist. Well, when somebody comes along and says, well, what is a woman? Usually what people come along and they start describing the eggs and the sperm and things like that. And then what's the next thing that usually happens? Well, what about Klinefelters? What about Turner's syndrome? We're pivoting. We're taking this notion and we're saying we're going to apply chromosomes to this mixture. Well, it turns out there's lots of different perspectives of sex in of itself. There's different layers that we have in the notion of what sex is all about. I created a slide that has about 20 or 30 bullet points of ways that we can look at sex.
That's a lot.
My wife looked at this slide and said, how many times can you put the word sex on one slide? My next phrase was touche.
Touche. We can put touche in there a lot too.
We can put touche in there a lot. So here's just some of the ways that we look at sex. There's chromosomal sex. There's external and anatomic sex, gonadal sex, genetic sex, the dictionary definition of sex, our phenotypic appearance of sex, how we look externally, hormonal sex, legal sex, biological sex. There's so many different ways of how we approach this topic that when we have these arguments and discussions, we pivot from one spot to another without actually going any deeper into the discussion.
Or looking at it as a whole.
Or looking at it as a whole. That's part of the problem. So we keep just kind of hitting here or hitting there. And what I wanted to do was get underneath it and go, what on earth is actually going on?
Okay. What'd you
So
find?
I had fun with that. Oh, all sorts of fun stuff. So I'm going to start with where we're at right now.
Okay.
Okay. So the common theme that happens out in the world right now is that sex is determined at conception, that it's immutable, that it doesn't change, and that your sex is determined at birth, and that it's XX for female and XY for male.
Okay.
So basically you have these two pathways right next to each other.
Right.
They don't cross, they don't merge, but for some weird reason, we have this other group of individuals called intersex that exists nebulous beyond that. Well, that's part of the problem. We have these two different pathways that exist. How do we incorporate intersex individuals into the midst of all this? How do they develop? We have to actually get to the root of how this happens, because we can learn a lot from them.
Okay.
And in the midst of learning a lot from them, we can help them. We can help this community do better.
I mean, I don't know. The first thought that comes to mind is if you have two options, option A or B, then if you don't fit into that, wouldn't that just make it a medical abnormality or some kind of a disability almost? Not maybe disability is not the right word, but
Disorder.
Disorder. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah.
But we're not disordered. We're humans. And just because we vary differently from another person to another person doesn't make us, wrong. We use the term disorder in the past to say that you're different than the normal.
Okay.
Well, in reality, this happens normally. This is part of nature. This is part of the genetic process, that people are part of this whole community of intersex. We're allowed to exist, and biologically it will happen regardless of anything that we do.
Well, then the argument that comes to mind for me that if that's a normal part of nature, do we see intersex individuals in the rest of the animal kingdom?
Yes. Just like we see homosexual behavior across the animal kingdom in over 1,500 different species, intersex exists throughout the animal kingdom. Hands down.
I think you just won Mario.
I did. But again, it comes down to why. Well, what I ended up doing was creating this this slide, this picture.
You should be good.
Okay, so when you look at this diagram, what I ended up doing is saying, what are all the sex structures inside the body that are related to each other? What do you need in terms of sex structures and physiology that creates a human being in terms of sexual reproduction?
Okay.
And I wanted to take away the sex or the sexing of it. You know, I didn't want to actually have male versus female. I wanted to say, where do we start with the gonads? Where do we start with the gametes? Where do we start with hormones, external anatomy, and so on and so forth? So there's 8 different structures in the center of this. And I put a gradient in there just because each one of these things are dynamic. They develop differently from person to person to person. On the outer ring is genetics. So this is a starting point. At the point of conception, you are presented with data.
Okay.
You have a collection of DNA that is going to create a person at the end of all this.
Okay.
Second, or the middle ring is development. Not only do we have to start with genetics, but we have to actually cross that thing through time. We have to get through this developmental process. So what are the stages of development? What's happening with those genetics in relation to development? When I take a genetics portion of this, how does it differ between the brain development versus the gamete development versus the gonadal development? Because the genes that are involved in each one of these structures is different. That should make sense. The genes that are involved in making the liver are different than the genes that are involved in making the heart.
That does make sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Different than what's being used to create the brain. So they did a study a few years ago on mice, and they said, okay, how many genes are involved in the development of the human ovary versus the human testes? Take a guess. Take a wild guess.
I don't know.
How many genes are involved in the development of the gonads? So there's 21,000 genes in the human genome, 21,000 protein encoding genes in the human genome. 6,000 of those are involved in the process of making the gonads.
Okay.
So when people come along and say, oh, it's the Y chromosome that makes the difference, it's the Y chromosome plus 6,000 different genes.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So when I look at the gonads, how do I compare that with the pituitary gland
Hold
development?
on. I may have messed something up. Give me a
Uh-oh.
second.
Oh no!
Right. So we were at the different
The number of
chromosomes.
Different-
Number of chromosomes.
So the number of chromosomes. So when you think of somebody who has differences in chromosome number, they're being presented to the body, this whole entire system with a different set of instructions that behave differently from person to person to person. Or if you have a variation in a gene that's somewhere in this metabolic pathway, this DNA pathway, you're going to get somebody whose phenotypically appears different than another person. So when you have, for example, like myself, Kallman syndrome, the I can't even talk anymore.
FGH1, I believe.
Yeah, FR1.
Oh, darn.
So the part of the body that is affected with me is, yes, the genetics, but the pituitary gland, the gonads, the hormones are all affected in me. Where if you have somebody who has congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the adrenal gland is enlarged, that's the adrenal gland that's affecting the hormones that can affect the brain. It can also affect the external anatomy with clitoromegaly. Or if you have somebody with, another one that's commonly talked about is androgen insensitivity syndrome, where that's a genetic, very strong genetic component to it that will affect the brain, how hormones work, how the gonads work, how the pituitary gland works. Because they don't respond to testosterone, their pituitary gland is unable to actually sense when to actually turn off testosterone development. So when you have somebody with gender identity variation, is it in the midst of all this? Yeah. with brain development and the genetics involved with that process, there's a whole slew of activity that's happening here that we haven't actually even gotten into yet. And I want to get into that, but this is helping to lay the foundation of how this works.
That is fascinating. That, I mean, and it breaks it down though. It makes so much more sense when I don't know. Your pie chart makes a lot of sense. Like when you're switching back and forth between them, it makes sense how you can have an intersectionality between all the development.
Yeah. All of a sudden, you can almost picture somebody else in there, like somebody who has low hormone levels or a difference in external anatomy development.
Yeah.
We can dive into that pie chart and research further, but always come back to this and say, here's my foundation that I'm working with. So I'm going to change the slides a little bit because I want to go back to, when I'm doing this whole, arm thing back and forth.
Yeah.
Because when I think about what's going on with a lot of these laws, I want to explain this slide. Do you see the bars?
Yes.
Perfect. So this is the former understanding of how biological sex develops. And this is where you're coming from with the starting at conception, your sex is determined at the point of conception because it's based off of the sex chromosomes. I put the term immutable in there, that it doesn't change. And then at birth, you are assigned male or female based off of this structure. Over to the right, I put the Punnett square in there, and it's like, okay, there's the Punnett square. 25% or 50% one way, 50% the other way. There are problems with this chart. There's problems with this methodology. And this includes everything from terms you probably don't recognize, like chimerism, aneuploidy, mosaicism. This doesn't describe intersex. This does not describe anatomic variation, gene activity. This is incongruent with evolution. And I had a huge discussion about how and why that actually works.
Okay.
But this is the current model that people are using to create the legislation that exists.
Well, and it's the model that you get in biology 101 in high school.
And you still get this model even in medical schools. And that's problematic because it's way outdated. A lot of this information that we're working with in here and now is relatively new within the past couple decades. But again, we're trying to readdress and reframe this compared to what we know now. So this is part of the reason why we have so many different narratives, is because we're comparing and contrasting the old versus the new. So let me show you the new. Looking back at the chart. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the next one. Okay, before I get to the big one that I want to reveal, let's talk about this one.
Okay.
Development is dynamic. So when a embryo is first conceived, sperm meets egg, they fuse together. It actually usually happens in the fallopian tube. What is the next goal of the embryo? It has nothing to do with reproduction. The first thing that an embryo is interested in is getting to the uterus and implanting. It needs nutrition. So that's its next goal. So it's dividing cells even while it's transporting into the uterus. It implants. Once it implants, the next thing that it's interested in is, again, not reproduction. The next thing it's interested in is direction. Up, down, left, right, front, back.
So that way the baby's not upside down or something inside the uterus.
Right, we have to figure out where the head is. We have to figure out where the feet's going. We have to figure out where the organs are situated inside the body. We're interested in orientation next. The next interest of the embryo, the developing fetus, is actually nutrition, the GI tract. Only after all this foundation is set are we interested in forming the organs that make us up and the reproductive system. So when we think about the chromosomes being the determination at the very beginning, the embryo doesn't care about that at the start. The embryo is interested in is nutrition, direction, survival. It can't get to reproduction until later. It shouldn't get into reproduction until later because that takes energy. And at the point in time, it has higher priorities than reproduction.
Which goes back to sex isn't determined at conception then.
Right.
Okay.
So this is part of the reason why And I'll show this here. So what we have to do, this is the modern developing slide that I work with. So the first thing we have to do is we have to create this foundation of human, the individual. And we all go through this. Yes, there's some variations between each one of us. There is going to be differences just genetically and biologically, bound to be. But the thing that brings us all together is we all have the same foundational structure that makes us human. It's not sexed, it's we are human. I call this the common development pathway.
Okay.
And the reason why I put in those terms right there, the mesonephros and the paramesonephros. These two structures are the primordial gonadal structures.
Okay.
So the mesonephros is the male structures. This is the epididymis, not the testes, not the prostate. That's a different pathway. But the structures, the tubes that lead from the penis to through the prostate into the testes.
Okay.
The paramesonephros, para meaning next to, is the early female structures. This is what develops into the uterus and parts of the upper vagina.
Okay. And for the people that are listening and not watching, the screen that we're looking at here, I don't even know, how would you describe it? I mean, right now I'm seeing like a rectangle, shows the foundation, and the mesonephros and paramesonephros are all combined together in common pathways for conception. But then after that, it kind of splits off.
Yeah. So once we have this foundation that's set here, in the middle there it has gonadal cell migration. The gonadal cells don't start next to the paramesonephros or the mesonephros. They travel. They migrate from a different location entirely. They have to travel to their intended location.
And this is why men think about sex.
Right. Which to me is fascinating because when we think about these cells traveling, they get lost. They get duplicated.
Most men
This
do.
is why right. But even these cells are undifferentiated. They have not even actually gone into the development of the ova or the testes at all.
Okay.
They are undifferentiated. So you can almost say they're non-binary.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask about that if non-binary has a scientific, I don't know.
Basis?
Sure. Yes.
Conceptually, it will actually work with this model.
Okay.
And actually, there's ways for even things like asexual or agender to exist in this model as well.
Fascinating. I'll let you finish explaining it, and then I want to know why.
Okay.
Or how.
So, yeah, I can get into that too. So sex determination does not happen at conception. It happens after all this foundation is laid. Only until all these structures are there does all these genes, all this activity start happening to differentiate between the male traditional pathway and female traditional pathway. And part of it is the SRY gene, but more importantly, it's the next one in process. It's that SOX9 that you can see in the middle of the screen.
Okay. What's
SOX9? SOX9 is a gene. It's a gene that's located on chromosome 17. So based off of chromosome 17, both males and females should have this one.
Okay.
Now, under normal circumstances, SOX9 is under lock and key. It's basically like you can imagine a cage sitting over SOX9.
Okay.
The SRY gene, which sits on the Y chromosome, comes along and is supposed to activate this. If it activates the SRY gene, the SOX9 gets released. SOX9 activates itself. It kind of auto-activates itself. And all of a sudden, you go down this male pathway. If it remains under lock and key, you continue down the female pathway. So this is where people come into the notion of you're female until proven otherwise.
I've never heard that.
Have you not heard that before? Where people say
No.
that you're always female at conception?
No, but now I do.
Okay, I see it all the time online. People argue this over and over and over again that every embryo is female. Like the answer is kinda, because there's this common foundation that we all start out with. It's more non-binary at the start, and unless something happens, yes, you fall down the female pathway. But it's the activation of SOX9 and a whole bunch of other genes that leads to male development.
Oh, I got so many questions now
No,
because, like,
that actually blows my mind because I too, heard of all embryos are female, and I've heard of that too, and my mind is just blown.
I love blowing people's minds. Now,
It's
here's the challenge.
incredible.
Here's the challenge. As you go down the male pathway, the female pathway is still there. It's still there. And what has to happen is it has to regress. So there is a hormone that does that. As the male pathway moves forward, it regresses the female pathway. As you move forward on the female pathway, you have to regress the male pathway. You have to go back to the mesonephros and regress it. So, interesting and fun fact, every human has remnants of these structures as an adult. So for males, it's actually on the testes. It's called the appendix testes, and that's the remnant of the paramesonephros. For females, it's a structure inside the vagina that's called the Gardner ducts. That's the remnant of the mesonephros. So every single person on this planet, to some degree or another, is quote unquote intersex.
wow. So, how far do you have to go before you are determined to be intersex then, if everybody shares that?
That's where the goalpost is gray area. Just like there's no formal definition of biological sex or sex in general, there is no complete definition of intersex because there's gray areas everywhere in between each one of these structures.
And that's part of what you're working on.
That's part of why I'm explaining it the way that I am, is that we need to get away from the old model so that we can understand how people exist within this framework that we call community. Allow them to exist.
Wow. This is interesting to me. I guess again for the people that are listening, what we're seeing on the screen is there is almost a cone shape that kind of expands out. So one pathway going up one side shows the traditional male pathways, and on the bottom it shows traditional female. But there's a triangle between all of it, saying so everybody is sharing traits going one way or another.
Yeah, exactly. And so is it possible for SOX9 to get activated without the SRY gene? Yes. Yes, there is. This is called De La Chapelle syndrome. This is an XX individual that activates their SOX9 gene and goes down the male pathway. You can actually do it without the SOX9 being activated too. Or there's I'm sorry, not the SOX9, but the SRY. You can do it with the SRY that moved to a different chromosome, or without. Somehow or another, the SOX9 got activated unexpectedly, and somebody who has XX chromosomes moved down that pathway. Or if you have somebody who has XY chromosomes, it's possible for that SOX9 to not be activated, or somewhere in the gene pathway to not activate, and you go down this female pathway. There's also gradations in between. It's not like a light switch on and off. There's degrees. There's spectrum. There's no.
And that's where we're getting the idea that gender is a spectrum.
Yes. Not only that, but sex is a spectrum too.
Okay. So then how does not asex, but agender fit into this?
So agender would be a gender identity, correct? You're thinking asexuality?
Well, asexuality would be oh my gosh. Now I'm starting to act like an expert, and I
Oh,
am
I'm
not
sorry.
an
So
expert at
yeah,
all.
so
But my understanding would be
you're actually
asexuality would be no
a relationship, a sexual orientation. Sorry.
right. So agender would be a lack of gender, right?
Right.
So how does that fit into this, where there is male or female pathways and everything in between? How do you get
So,
outside of that?
oh, this is where it gets even more fun. So this sets a foundation. This is where we're talking about the body.
Okay.
Now we have to relate this to the mind. And we may want to pause a little bit and maybe turn this into a part 3,
Okay.
because relating the foundation to the mind is this whole separate discussion.
Okay. That's fair. Uh,
We are open to a part 3. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and end it here. We'll jump into a part 3 here in just a second for everybody tuning in. This is fascinating. Please come back and listen to part 3.
You're not going to want to miss this. This is science. This is medical. This is everything that we been wanting to ask, but we don't know how to ask because we have never seen. I have never seen graphs like this before. I have never ever, and this is again, it blows my mind. The information that you have and what you've researched has absolutely blown my mind, and I want a part 3, 4, 5. Like, I want to know all of it because this is brand new to me, and this is 5,000% fascinating. So yeah, no, I want a part 3. Let's keep going.
All right.
Let's
So
hear more.
we'll break it there and we'll come back for part 3.
Cool.
Yeah. And I